To this online lecture series on American drama. So far, we have looked at the background of American drama and how it culminated into what it is today. We looked at the history of how America came to be as a nation politically, how it freed itself from the clutches of the British and developed its own artistic forms, developed a distinct identity, a distinct artistic voice. Then we moved on to studying Eugene O'Neill's The Hairy Ape. So far, we looked at the important characters, we looked at the summary, the brief description of the play, and what each character represents, whether it is Yank, Mildred, Long, or Paddy. And today, we will be looking at the aesthetic choices that Eugene O'Neill puts to display in this particular play. By the 1920s, expressionist form of art had gained momentum in America. What is expressionism? How is it different from realism or naturalism is something that we'll be looking at during the course of this lecture. But to begin with, let's look at the instructions for the setting of the landscape that Eugene O'Neill provides us in this particular play. Let's read the very first scene or the very first description of the setting that is given in this particular play. The treatment of this scene or of any other scene in the play should by no means be naturalistic. Should by no means be naturalistic. Now, what does Eugene O'Neill exactly mean when he says that it should not be naturalistic by any sense? What Eugene O'Neill is going against is the convention of trying to make the stage and eventually the actors look as real or as realistic representations of real life on stage as possible. There is no attempt, there is no pretension whatsoever on part of the director or on part of the actors performing the play that they are trying to recreate the world that one already is aware of on the outside of the theatre. Moving on, he also goes on to say that the actors stand in a way which accentuates the natural stooping posture. This is done in some sense to dehumanize or at least to symbolically attempt to portray the dehumanization of the actors, especially the workers who are being portrayed in the play. They may not necessarily behave or necessarily stand in such a way in real life, but expressionist theatre uses such technical devices in order to convey certain emotions or to convey certain realities in forms which will not be as absolutely real or as direct as we expect them to be. Moving on, when he describes the workers, this is what Eugene O'Neill has to say. All are hairy-chested, with long arms of tremendous power and low receding brows above their small, fierce, resentful eyes. All the civilized white races are represented, but except for the slight differentiation in color of hair, skin, eyes, all these men are alike. This goes against the very convention of forming distinctive characters that one generally sees in a realist or a conventional or traditional play. Here, instead of carving out distinctive voices and distinctive characters and distinguishing them from one to the other, Eugene O'Neill emphasizes on their sameness. He emphasizes on the fact that they all look like an amorphous mass. By amorphous, I mean people who are not distinctive or units that are not distinctive from each other. So the workers end up being represented as an amorphous mass of human beings or humanity which is hardly distinctive from each other. The workers, instead of having unique, distinct personalities, become a clump of humanity that one sees in front of them. That is representative of the exploitative working conditions, the dehumanization that the workers undergo on a daily basis in the 1920s of America that Eugene O'Neill is trying to represent. Now looking at naturalism in detail. What exactly is naturalism? How exactly does it find itself expressed in the plays in 1920s America and especially that of Eugene O'Neill? And how, to what extent does Eugene O'Neill in some sense differ or waver away from the molds of naturalism which his predecessors had clung on to? Naturalism is generally used as a loose synonym for realism. It is an interest in the natural world, as the term itself suggests. It was a byproduct of an increasing amount of scientific disciplines which had unlocked a huge vista of knowledge about the real world that was hitherto unknown to most people. The development of botany, the development of chemistry, physics, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, all these things gave us a window into a world that was completely unexplored before. And that is how the phenomenon of naturalism seeped into the artistic world as well. It is not only a mere interest in the natural world, but an interest in the natural world to the point where it is being observed from a very scientific perspective, and there is an attempt to recreate or represent it faithfully in works of art. Naturalistic representations could be either represented in paintings or even in literature, whether it is on the stage or in novels or even in poetry. Naturalistic works generally use realistic methods and subjects to convey the belief that everything that exists is part of nature and can be explained by material causes. In that sense, it follows the scientific theory of causality. It does not lend itself to supernatural elements. It generally sticks to the world that we know, the material world as we know it, and therefore refuses to find any escape in the metaphysical or the supernatural. The subjects, that is the characters or the themes that naturalistic works deal with, are also based in real life. They're rooted in reality. They're rooted in reality to the point where the readers of these works find themselves immersed in the realities that are being represented as they see it naturally unfolding around themselves on a day-to-day basis. Naturalism was an eventual byproduct of realism. Realism, in some sense, preceded naturalism as it relied on a faithful representation of reality. Naturalism was merely an extension to a certain degree of realism onto the world of nature as well, or the natural world as well. It was a byproduct of Darwin's biological theories, as we know the theory of evolution, and also Auguste Comte's scientific study of society. A naturalistic approach to interpret life, depict social environment, and dwell on the shortcomings of what it means to be human. A naturalistic approach meant a realist approach, an approach which was grounded in reality to interpret life without necessarily falling prey or taking recourse to metaphysical or religious explanations. It focused on depicting the social environment that it saw around them and dwell on the shortcomings of what it means to be human. What it means to be human in a society which is flawed, which is inherently has its own shortcomings, of what it means to be human in a society which invariably keeps claiming a stake in the humanity of the individuals being discussed in all these works. The naturalist vision is generally subjective, and the tone of the novels are generally somber in nature. They are very serious, and you will rarely ever find comic elements in naturalist works. Naturalism as an artistic movement, as a literary movement, inspired a great plethora of authors, including Henrik Ibsen, who was an artistic predecessor of Eugene O'Neill. Eugene O'Neill was greatly inspired by Ibsen, and he attended many of Ibsen's performances, many of the performances of Ibsen's plays on a regular basis. Apart from Ibsen, it also inspired Strindberg, Chekhov, Tolstoy, and Gorky as well. Emile Zola was one of the most important exponents of naturalism who observed society like a scientist. His descriptions of characters are detailed to the point where they are almost exact representations of the French society that he was a part of. The underlying principle, the underlying value system of naturalism is a kind of social determinism. Now, what do we mean when we say social determinism? Social determinism means that an individual is largely influenced and his fate is largely sealed by the society that he is a part of and the social, political, economic influences that constantly keep working on him or her throughout his or her life. Therefore, the level of agency that an individual has in a naturalist worldview is perhaps as good as negligible. The individual becomes a mere pawn in the hands and under the influences of the larger societal forces that are constantly working at him and influencing his or her life to be moved in a particular direction. Naturalism as a school of thought began in Germany and France and over a period of time spread to other European nations as well. From naturalism, we move on to what we call as expressionism. In Eugene O'Neill's play, there is a tension, a constant tension and of navigation between these two movements. Eugene O'Neill invariably chooses expressionism as his preferred mode of artistic representation. Nevertheless, he was also inspired by the naturalist dramas that were his predecessors. What exactly is expressionism? The term expressionism was probably used for paintings by a painter called Julian August Hearn. His works were published around 1901, and the art movement began in Germany around 1905. Painters during this period avoided representation of external reality. Painters, instead of painting the exact replica of the world that they saw around them, preferred to portray the manner in which they saw the world with their own eyes. The best example of this form of painting or this form of artistic expressionism would be Van Gogh's Starry Night. If you look at the painting of Van Gogh's Starry Night, you will realize that it is a representation of a small town at night. And yet it does not look anywhere close to how an actual town would look at night. The planets are too big, the clouds are differently shaped, the lines of the buildings are not distinctively clear. And yet it is one of the most important paintings in the history of European art. The reason it moved away from naturalism was the advent of the camera. By the early 20th century, the advent of the camera made it virtually possible for photographers to represent reality as exactly as it was humanly possible. Color photographs had not yet begun, nevertheless, reality was easily reflected in those photographs. And hence, there was an increasing need among painters that was felt to transcend reality and express their inner psychological realities. Expressionism, if one has to define it in one line, was an attempt to project a highly personal vision of the world as a portal to one's inner psychological realities. Van Gogh's Starry Night was an attempt of not how the whole world saw a city or a town at night, how we perceived the city in his own mind. And that's how he represented the town or the starry night on his canvas. The underlying principle of expressionism was that expression is supreme and expression would dominate the form, irrespective of the genre of art that we were working under. And by a logical corollary of that statement, expression would also determine imagery, punctuation, syntax, and all these things can be modified and adapted to the vision of the artist. The formal rules of writing can also be adapted to suit the purpose of the art. So when it came to writing in prose, that is novels or dramas, the language did not necessarily subscribe to the conventional grammatical rules. Expressionism allowed authors the freedom to use language in a way which suited their purpose, which suited the effect, which they could use to carry out the effect that they wanted to have on their audience, was in some sense a reaction to and against realism. Over the last few decades, because of realism and naturalism, there was a sense of fatigue that had developed in the world of art as it became very conventional to portray the real world and to state as true to reality as we perceived it. Over a period of time, due to the advent of expressionism and the need for experimentation, artists felt a need to move beyond representing reality as it is and trying to experiment with how they perceived the world in their own eyes. By the 1920s, expressionism, which had begun in Germany, was to a great degree confined to England and America. This movement influenced great artists and writers like Kafka, Woolf, Joyce, Faulkner, Beckett, and many others. Steinberg's The Dream Play or The Ghost Sonata are important examples of expressionist art. Moving on to another genre of theatre, that is comedy. To understand Eugene O'Neill's The Hairy Ape, we need to have some grounding, some understanding of what is a comedy and how is it different from a tragedy. To understand Eugene O'Neill's The Hairy Ape, we need to have a basic understanding of two different forms of theatre, two different forms of drama, that is comedy and tragedy. We will look at the former to begin with. The word comedy comes from the Greek word komos, which means merrymaking or to have fun, to put it in layman's terms. It is a depiction of traditionally everyday characters, which ultimately leads to the delivery of a happy resolution. So you will have a bunch of characters which you see in a day-to-day life, generally depicting a domestic situation. And the conflict among them ultimately leads to a happy ending, a happy resolution, which is not very different from any conventional commercial Bollywood film that we generally witness. A drama or a comedy could be written in prose and poetry, both forms. You have multiple versions, many types of comedy. That is a comedy of humors, a comedy of intrigue, which is characters trying to outwit each other, characters trying to be verbose, characters trying to engage in verbal quips with each other, which one witnesses in restoration comedy. You also have something called black comedy, which generally carries dark undertones. It deals with aspects of humanity which conventionally would not be considered as fit subjects for comedy. Nevertheless, they are made light of. A good example of a black comedy film in Bollywood cinema would be a film called Saath Khoon Maaf. That was a great example of how a black comedy can be executed in Hindi cinema. Then you have farce, which lead to almost comical situations which one would never witness in real life. Burlesque, which is an outlandish form of comedy. Romantic comedy, where you have characters, where there's a romantic elements, where you have characters romantically interested with each other, but out of some confusion or with the need to hide their romantic inclinations, comedy develops. You have satire, which can be serious, which can be deeply political, and ultimately tragic comedy, which is a combination of tragedy and comedy. And that is what Eugene O'Neill's The Hairy Ape is. It is ultimately a tragic comic play. Moving on to the other aspect of Eugene O'Neill's The Hairy Ape, which is a tragedy. Now, the word tragedy comes from the Greek meaning goat song. It was a ritualistic act, a ritual sacrifice in honor of Dionysus, the god of the fields and vineyards. A tragic play was generally performed as a sacrificial purpose to appease the gods, in this case, the god being Dionysus. There were multiple definitions given of Greek tragedies by greats like Aristotle. For Aristotle, a Greek tragedy would mean the imitation of action that is serious. So, a tragedy was inherently about a topic which was very serious. It had to arouse pity and fear in the minds of the audience. And it had to accomplish a catharsis of emotions. A catharsis of emotions would refer to a complete outpouring, a complete letting go of emotions. Aristotle saw plot as more important than character. So, in a tragedy for Aristotle, the plot, rather what the story is about, becomes far more important than the characters themselves. For a Greek tragedy, the tragic hero becomes the most important unit in a tragic play after the plot itself. Now, who exactly is a tragic hero? Who can become a tragic hero? A tragic hero, by definition in a Greek tragedy, would be the most virtuous. And his downfall would generally be brought about not by any vice but by an error of judgment. So a tragic hero would be heroic. In most Greek plays, the tragic heroes would generally be kings and they would overwhelmingly be males. And their downfall would not necessarily be brought about because of a vice or a character defect, but an error of judgment that they made with which an audience could very well sympathize. And examples of tragic heroes would be Oedipus in Greek plays, and the same definition continued over centuries right up to Elizabethan drama, where plays like Hamlet and Macbeth were also the underlying story of both these plays are characters which have nobility, which have great virtue within them, but an error of judgment, wrong decisions made by them eventually lead to their unfortunate demise. There was a gradual change in this tragic vision over the next few centuries after Shakespeare. By the time of Henrik Ibsen and Strindberg, this tragic vision was modified and adapted to suit the needs of modern society, especially modern Scandinavian society as they saw it. It portrays a society that is spiritually and morally corrupt. It betrays a certain corruption that is all encompassing. Even if that individual manages to stay above that corruption, is by the end of the play engulfed and consumed by the society, by this very society which is spiritually and morally corrupt. Now finally we come to what is exactly a tragic comedy. A tragic comedy is a combination or a synthesis of a tragedy and a comedy. We've already discussed the large highlights of what a comedy is and what is a tragedy. But a tragicomedy is a unique product of the modern age, although not necessarily exclusive to the modern world. The term derives from a reference by Plautus, the Roman dramatist, to the unconventional mixture of kings, gods, and servants. Nevertheless, tragic comedy as we understand it today is undoubtedly a product of modernity. In a tragic comedy, there is an overlap between tragic comedy and black comedy. There is no necessarily distinct separation between the two spheres of a tragic comedy and a black comedy. This genre was resurrected or reinvented by Eugene O'Neill and later by Samuel Beckett in his play Waiting for Godot. If you try to analyze and understand Eugene O'Neill's The Hairy Ape from the lens of what it means to be a tragic comedy, you will realize that Hank's attempts at finding or seeking revenge against Mildred's insult to a large degree are comic in nature. But his attempt to find his humanity, his attempt to re-establish what it means to be a worker who has dignity, what it means to be a human being who contributes in a modern industrialist capitalist society, ultimately leads to a tragic search for that very identity, leading to his eventual death. And that is what, in essence, is a tragic comedy. Man's constant search for answers to the questions that plague humanity, which ultimately ends in failure. There is virtue in the fact that the search constantly persists despite the difficulties, but the comic element is in the fact that both the readers and the characters know that it is ultimately eventually going to lead to nothingness.